Racist white cop shoots black boy for trespassing, not realizing the boy's father would judge the case. Officer Mason James stood frozen, his gun trembling in his hand. The smell of gunpowder still lingered in the air. A lifeless young boy lay on the manicured lawn, blood pooling beneath him. His wide eyes stared blankly at the night sky, as if asking why his life had just ended. The boy had been holding a basketball. The gated community was eerily silent, except for the soft hum of distant crickets. Porch lights flickered on one by one as curious neighbors peeked out. Bradley's heart raced as he heard faint sirens growing louder. He hadn't planned on shooting the kid. It was supposed to be a warning shot. His voice cracked as he whispered to himself, "He shouldn't have been here. He shouldn't have run." The officer didn't notice the black sedan pulling up until a man in a dark suit stepped out. That man was Judge Henry Thomas, famous for his stern rulings and unshakable sense of justice. And the lifeless boy was his son. Judge Wright's expression turned from confusion to horror as his eyes landed on the boy. He sprinted forward, his trembling hands hovering above the body, afraid to touch it, as if doing so would confirm his worst fear. His wail shattered the tense silence, cutting through the night like a blade. "No, Lewis." Bradley's grip tightened on his gun. The realization hit him like a freight train. He had just killed the son of one of the most powerful judges in the state. The sirens were deafening now as flashing red and blue lights painted the scene. Bradley felt his knees buckle. He knew this wasn't going to end like every other shooting incident where the badge shielded him. Not this time. Judge Wright slowly turned his tear-streaked face toward him, his voice a low growl. "You'll pay for this." The day had started much like any other for Officer Mason James. He sat in his patrol car, sipping coffee and scrolling through his phone. The call came in around 6:45 p.m., a report of trespassing in a gated neighborhood. The caller claimed that a suspicious-looking black kid was wandering around. Bradley didn't think much of it. These calls were common, and they rarely led to anything serious. Lewis Wright, the 13-year-old son of Judge Henry Thomas, wasn't trespassing. He had been playing basketball at the community court, but when the ball rolled beyond the fence, he chased after it, unaware that he had stepped onto private property. The neighbors, ever vigilant, didn't hesitate to call the police. Lewis was an ordinary kid. He loved basketball, comic books, and annoying his older sister. That evening, he had promised to be home by 7 p.m. to catch dinner with his family. He never made it. When Bradley arrived, Louis was already walking back toward the court, holding the ball. The officer stepped out of his car, hand resting on his holstered gun. "Hey, stop right there," he shouted. Louis froze, unsure what he'd done wrong. "I was just—" "Hands up," Bradley interrupted, his voice sharper than he intended. Louis hesitated, his young mind racing. He'd been taught what to do in situations like this, but fear paralyzed him. He dropped the ball and raised his hands, palms trembling. Bradley's mind was clouded with assumptions. His adrenaline surged as he took in the boy's hoodie and the way he hesitated. To Bradley, it all seemed like defiance. When Louis instinctively took a step back, Bradley drew his weapon. "I said stop!" Bradley shouted again. Louis panicked and turned to run. Bradley's pulse thundered in his ears. In that split second, he decided to fire, believing he needed to control the situation before it spiraled out of hand. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the neighborhood. Earlier that evening, Henry Thomas had been sitting in his study, reviewing a stack of case files. His wife, Elsie, was cooking dinner, and their daughter, Stella, was upstairs chatting with friends. Louis had been late coming home, but Marcus wasn't worried. He trusted his son and knew the community was safe. That illusion shattered when his phone rang. A neighbor's shaky voice on the other end informed him that something terrible had happened near the basketball court. Marcus drove over without a second thought, expecting a minor accident. Instead, he found his son's lifeless body. As the medics arrived, Bradley stood off to the side, his mind spinning. His body felt heavy, his uniform suffocating. This wasn't supposed to happen. It was just a kid. Judge Wright didn't care about Bradley's inner turmoil. All he cared about was the lifeless body on the ground. He knew who Bradley was an officer with a record of minor complaints, none of which had led to disciplinary action. Marcus had seen too many cases like this, where a badge meant immunity. The officers who arrived on the scene tried to de-escalate the situation. One of them pulled Bradley aside. "Just keep quiet for now," they advised him. "We'll sort this out." But Judge Wright wasn't planning to let it be sorted out. He clenched his fists, seething with a rage he'd never felt before. His son was gone, and the man who had taken his life stood just a few feet away, trying to justify his actions. The sound of the body bag zipping up marked the end of Louis's life, but it was just the beginning of something far bigger. Henry Thomas stood as the ambulance drove away, vowing silently that this wouldn't end here. His voice broke the tension. "You'll face me in court, Officer Porter, and I'll make sure you never forget my son's name." The police chief arrived soon after, his face pale as he realized the gravity of the situation. Bradley was escorted away, his badge and gun confiscated. He glanced back at the scene, knowing his life was about to change forever. The chapter ended with Judge Wright staring at the empty street where the ambulance had vanished, his mind racing with plans. The system had protected men like Bradley for too long, but this time, the judge would ensure justice. He wouldn't just be grieving Louis, he would be fighting for him. Bradley sat in the holding room at the station, his head buried in his hands. The weight of the situation pressed on him like a vice. Every breath felt shallow, every noise too loud. He couldn't stop replaying the moment in his mind, the sound of the gunshot, the boy falling, the way Judge Wright had looked at him like he was a monster. The door creaked open, and Albert Stevens walked in, his face grim. "Bradley," he said, sitting down across from him. "This is bad, real bad." Bradley didn't lift his head. "It was an accident," he murmured. "He ran. I thought he was going to—" "Save it," Stevens snapped. "That kid didn't have a weapon, didn't even make a threatening move. You shot an unarmed child in the wealthiest neighborhood in the city. And to top it off, he's Judge Wright's son." Bradley's stomach churned. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." Stevens leaned in, lowering his voice. "It doesn't matter if you knew or not. The press is already on this, and Wright isn't just any judge. He's got the connections and the reputation to turn this into a national scandal. You're going to be arrested, Bradley. There's no way around it." Back at the Wright household, Elsie Wright sat on the couch, clutching Louis's hoodie to her chest. The house was eerily quiet, except for the occasional sniffle from Stella upstairs. Marcus paced the room, his mind racing. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the sheer rage coursing through his veins. "How could this happen?" Elsie whispered, her voice barely audible. "Louis wasn't doing anything wrong. He was just a boy." Marcus paused, staring out the window at the streetlights glowing faintly in the dark. "It happened because of who he was," he said, his voice hard. "Because he was black in a neighborhood where they think we don't belong. That officer didn't see a son. He saw a threat." Elsie sobbed quietly. "He was just a baby. He had so much ahead of him." Marcus clenched his fists. "I'll make sure Mason James pays for this. He'll go to prison for the rest of his life if it's the last thing I do." Elsie looked up at him, her eyes red and swollen. "Promise me, Marcus. Promise me you'll fight for Louis." Marcus knelt down in front of her, taking her hands in his. "I promise." The next morning, the story was plastered across every news channel and social media platform. "Unarmed black teen killed by officer in gated community," read one headline. "Judge's son shot in tragic incident," read another. Protests began to erupt, began forming outside the police station with crowds holding signs that read, "Justice for Louis" and "Stop killing our kids." Inside the station, Bradley watched the news coverage on a small TV in the corner of the room. His face was pale, his hands trembling. He could see the protesters from the window, chanting his name along with Louis's. He felt like a cornered animal, trapped with no way out. Albert Stevens returned, this time accompanied by two other officers. "Mason James," he said, his voice heavy. "You're under arrest for the shooting of Louis Wright." Bradley stood slowly, his legs weak. The officers cuffed his hands behind his back and led him out of the room. As he walked through the station, every eye was on him, some filled with pity, others with disgust. When he stepped outside, the roar of the crowd hit him like a wall. People shouted insults, threw bottles and trash, and demanded justice. Bradley kept his head down, but he could feel their hatred like a physical force. Meanwhile, Marcus was meeting with his legal team. His closest advisor, Brooke Green, was going over the preliminary details of the case. "The evidence is strong," she said, flipping through a file. "Witnesses heard the gunshot and saw Lewis lying there, unarmed. Porter's body cam footage shows he didn't follow proper protocol. This is a solid case." Marcus nodded, but his jaw was tight. "I don't want this to just be about Mason James. This needs to send a message to the department, to the city, to the entire country. We can't let this keep happening." Brooke hesitated. "That's a tall order, Marcus. You're not just going after one officer, you're challenging the entire system." Marcus's eyes burned with determination. "Good. The system needs to change. Lewis didn't deserve this, and neither does any other child." Bradley's first court appearance was scheduled for the following week, but the tension in the city was already boiling over. Protests grew larger, spreading to other cities. The police department was under intense scrutiny, with calls for reforms and demands to defund the force. Inside his cell, Bradley felt the walls closing in. His lawyer, a seasoned defense attorney named Peter Lawson, visited him regularly, trying to prepare him for the trial. "The prosecution is going to paint you as a racist, trigger-happy cop," Lawson said during one visit. "They'll dig up every complaint against you, every bad decision you've ever made on the job." Bradley shook his head. "I'm not racist," he said defensively. "I was just trying to do my job," Lawson sighed. "Intent doesn't matter, Bradley. Perception does. And right now, the world sees you as the face of everything wrong with policing." The chapter ended with Henry Thomas standing in his study, staring at a framed photo of Lewis on the desk. The boy's bright smile and shining eyes were a painful reminder of what had been taken from him. Marcus clenched the frame in his hands, his voice trembling with emotion. "You'll get justice, son," he whispered. "I swear it." The courtroom was packed to capacity. Every seat was taken, with dozens more standing at the back. News cameras lined the hallways, and reporters whispered into microphones outside the courthouse. This wasn't just a trial, it was an event. Mason James sat at the defense table, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his tie. He could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes on him. His lawyer, Peter Lawson, leaned over and whispered, "Stay calm. Let me do the talking." Across the room, Henry Thomas sat at the prosecution table, his face a mask of cold resolve. He was dressed immaculately in a dark suit, his posture straight and unyielding. Beside him sat Brooke Green, the lead prosecutor, flipping through her opening statement. She leaned over to Marcus. "Ready?" Marcus nodded, his gaze never leaving Bradley. "I've been ready since the moment he pulled that trigger." The judge entered, and the room fell silent. "All rise," the bailiff announced as the judge took her seat. She glanced at Marcus briefly, a flicker of recognition crossing her face. The trial was underway. The prosecution wasted no time setting the tone. Brooke Green's voice was steady but piercing as she addressed the jury. Lewis Wright was 13 years old. He was unarmed. He was innocent. And he is dead because Officer Mason James decided that a young black boy chasing a basketball was a threat. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. The evidence will show that Officer Porter did not follow protocol, that he acted recklessly, and that his actions were fueled by bias. This was not just a tragic accident. It was a preventable death. Bradley shifted uncomfortably in his seat as the prosecutor continued. Brooke projected an image of Louis on the screen, a smiling boy holding a basketball. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Elsie Wright, sitting in the front row, stifled a sob. When it was Peter Lawson's turn, he rose slowly, buttoning his jacket. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "this case is not as simple as the prosecution wants you to believe." Officer Porter responded to a call about a suspicious person. He made a split-second decision in a high-stress situation. Was it a mistake? Yes, but a mistake does not make a man a murderer. Outside the courthouse, the city was in turmoil. Protesters filled the streets, holding signs and chanting for justice. The case had become a flashpoint, drawing national attention. Celebrities tweeted their support for the Wright family, while pundits debated the trial on every major news network. Stella Wright, Lewis's older sister, found it hard to cope with the sudden attention. At school, classmates whispered behind her back. On social media, strangers either offered condolences or spewed vile comments defending Bradley. One evening, she broke down in her room, unable to hold it in any longer. Her mother found her curled up on the floor, sobbing into her pillow. "I can't take it anymore," Stella choked out. "They keep saying horrible things about Louis, about us, like he deserved it." Elsie sat down beside her, pulling her into a hug. "Listen to me," she said softly. "People will say all kinds of things, but none of it changes who Louis was. He was kind, smart, and so full of life." Stella sniffled, nodding. "I just miss him so much." "I do too," Elsie said, her voice breaking. "But your father's going to make sure the world knows the truth." Back in the courtroom, the prosecution called its first witness, a neighbor who had seen the shooting from her window. She described the scene in vivid detail, her voice trembling as she recounted hearing the gunshot and seeing Louis fall. "He didn't do anything wrong," she said, her eyes welling up with tears. "He was just a kid." The defense countered by questioning her vantage point and implying that she couldn't have seen everything clearly. Peter Lawson pressed her, asking if she'd heard Louis speak or saw any sudden movements. The woman hesitated, giving Lawson the opening he needed to sow doubt. The day ended with Marcus taking the stand. The courtroom was silent as he recounted the moment he found his son lying lifeless on the ground. His voice cracked. As he described Louis's love for basketball, his dreams of becoming an engineer, and the hole his death had left in their family, Marcus said, his voice heavy with emotion, "No parent should have to bury their child, especially not like this." That night, Bradley lay awake in his cell. He couldn't escape the image of Lewis's face. He replayed the moment over and over, wondering if he could have done something differently. His lawyer had told him not to dwell on it, to focus on the trial, but it was impossible. The guilt was eating him alive. He thought about his own family, his wife, his 2 kids. They hadn't come to see him since the arrest. He wasn't sure if they even wanted to. The news had painted him as a monster, and part of him was starting to believe it. The chapter ended with Marcus sitting alone in his study, staring at the case files spread out before him. He knew the defense would try to tear apart his family's story, to paint Bradley as a victim of circumstance. But Marcus was determined. He picked up a photo of Louis, his face hardening. "I'll make them see the truth," he whispered, "even if it destroys me." The second week of the trial brought an unrelenting storm of tension. Crowds outside the courthouse had doubled, and the media frenzy showed no signs of slowing. As Mason James entered the courtroom each morning, escorted by deputies, he was met with jeers and shouts from protesters demanding justice. The weight of it all was crushing, and each day felt like a lifetime. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution continued its methodical dismantling of Bradley's actions. Brooke Green introduced the body cam footage as evidence, and the jury watched in silence as the events of that fateful night played out on the screen. The grainy video showed Bradley approaching Louis with his gun drawn, shouting commands in a voice dripping with aggression. Lewis's trembling hands were visible as he dropped the basketball and raised them in surrender. The moment he turned to run, the screen froze as the gunshot rang out. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Elsie Wright covered her face, weeping softly, while Marcus sat stone-faced, his hands clenched tightly. Brooke paused the footage and turned to the jury. "This is not the behavior of a professional officer. This is not the behavior of someone protecting and serving. This is recklessness. This is bias. And this is why Louis Wright is dead." The defense scrambled to recover from the damaging evidence. Peter Lawson called Bradley to the stand, hoping to humanize him before the jury. Bradley's hands trembled as he adjusted the microphone, his voice barely audible at first. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he said, his voice cracking. "I was responding to a call about trespassing. I thought he might have been dangerous." Brooke Green seized the opportunity during cross-examination. "Dangerous?" she repeated, her tone sharp. "A 13-year-old boy holding a basketball? What exactly about him was dangerous, Officer Porter?" Bradley faltered, sweat beading on his forehead. He ran. I thought he might have had a weapon." "Did you see a weapon?" Brooke pressed. "No," Bradley admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "So you shot an unarmed boy in the back because he ran?" Brooke's voice rose, each word hitting like a hammer. "Does running now qualify as a threat in your training?" Bradley looked down, unable to meet her eyes. "It wasn't like that," he muttered weakly. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, the damage to Bradley's defense clear. The jury's expressions ranged from disgust to pity, but none looked sympathetic. Outside the courthouse, tensions were reaching a boiling point. Protesters clashed with counter-protesters, and police were deployed to control the crowds. Signs reading "Justice for Louis" were held high, while others accused the Wright family of exploiting the tragedy for attention. Stella Wright walked past the chaos with her mother, their heads down as they entered the courthouse. Stella glanced at one of the counter-protesters holding a sign that read, "Support our officers." Her stomach twisted, but she kept walking. "Mama," she whispered as they climbed the steps, "why do they hate us so much?" Elsie paused, looking down at her daughter with weary eyes. "Because they're afraid," she said softly. "Afraid of change. Afraid of losing their power. But don't let their fear silence you. Your brother deserves better." The trial's turning point came when the prosecution called Dr. Evelyn Carter, an expert on racial bias in policing, to the stand. She presented data showing a pattern of excessive force used disproportionately against black citizens, particularly unarmed black men and boys. "Officer Porter's actions are not isolated," she explained to the jury. "They are part of a larger systemic issue. This case is not just about one bad decision. It's about a culture that views black bodies as inherently threatening." Peter Lawson attempted to discredit her testimony, arguing that systemic issues were irrelevant to the specific circumstances of the case. But her words lingered in the air, resonating with the jury. Later that evening, Henry Thomas sat in his office, staring at his son's old basketball. He turned it over in his hands, the familiar scuffs and marks a painful reminder of Lewis's love for the game. The trial was taking its toll, but Marcus refused to falter. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was Brooke Green, carrying a folder. "We need to talk," she said, her expression grim. "What is it?" Marcus asked, his voice tight. Brooke hesitated before speaking. "There's something in Mason James's personnel file you need to see. It's significant." Marcus opened the folder and scanned the document inside. His eyes narrowed as he read the details. Bradley had been the subject of multiple complaints over his career. Accusations of excessive force, racial profiling, and misconduct. None of the complaints had resulted in disciplinary action, but the pattern was undeniable. "This changes everything," Marcus said, his voice low but firm. "We need to use this." The chapter ended with Marcus calling his wife into the room. He handed her the file, his jaw set. "They tried to bury this," he said, "but now the truth is coming out. This isn't just about Louis anymore. It's about every child like him who's been silenced." Elsie looked at the file, then back at her husband. "Then let's make sure they hear us," she said, her voice steady, loud and clear. The courtroom was buzzing with anticipation as the trial resumed the following morning. Word had spread about the contents of Mason James's personnel file, and the atmosphere was electric. Reporters were eager to break the latest developments, and the Wright family sat silently, their determination palpable. Brooke Green wasted no time calling her next witness, Albert Stevens, Bradley's superior officer. Stevens walked to the stand, his face grim, clearly uncomfortable with the position he was in. After he was sworn in, Brooke began her line of questioning. "Albert Stevens, you've supervised..." Officer Porter for several years, correct? Brooke asked. Yes, Stevens replied, his voice cautious. And during that time, how many complaints were filed against him by civilians? Brooke's tone was sharp. Stevens shifted in his seat. There were a few, he admitted reluctantly. How many, Albert? Brooke pressed. Stevens sighed, glancing at the jury before answering. 12. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Brooke stepped closer to the stand. 12 complaints. And how many of those complaints were related to racial profiling or excessive force? Stevens hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. Most of them. And what actions were taken against Officer Porter as a result of these complaints? Brooke asked, her voice growing colder. Stevens hesitated again, his discomfort obvious. None. They were investigated, but there wasn't enough evidence to pursue disciplinary action. Brooke raised an eyebrow. No evidence or no willingness to hold him accountable, Peter Lawson objected, but the damage was already done. The jury's expressions shifted, their unease evident. The pattern of complaints painted a damning picture, and Brooke had made sure they understood that this wasn't an isolated incident. Back in his cell that evening, Bradley felt the walls closing in. The media had gotten hold of the personnel file, and his name was being dragged through the mud. Headlines blared accusations of racism, and pundits debated whether he'd ever been fit to serve as a police officer. Peter Lawson visited him that night, his face tired and drawn. This isn't looking good, Bradley, he admitted. The jury isn't just judging you for what happened to Lewis. They're judging your entire career. Bradley buried his face in his hands. It's not fair, he muttered. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Fair or not, this is the reality, Lawson said bluntly. We need to shift the narrative. The jury needs to see you as human, not a symbol of everything wrong with the system. Meanwhile, at the Wright household, Marcus sat at the dinner table with Elsie and Stella. The weight of the trial hung over them like a cloud, but they were determined to stay strong for Louis. Dad, Stella said hesitantly, breaking the silence. Do you think they'll convict him? Marcus sighed, choosing his words carefully. I believe the evidence is strong, and the truth is on our side. But it's not just about convicting him. It's about making sure this never happens again. Stella nodded, though her face remained troubled. I hate that they're trying to make Louis look like he did something wrong. He didn't deserve this. Elsie reached across the table, squeezing her daughter's hand. We know the truth, Stella, and we're going to make sure the world knows it too. The trial took a dramatic turn when Brooke Green introduced a former officer who had worked with Bradley. The man, Officer Adam Ramirez, had left the department years earlier and now worked as a private investigator. His testimony was explosive. I worked with Bradley for 3 years, Ramirez said, his voice steady. I witnessed behavior that concerned me, comments about certain communities, jokes that crossed the line, and when I brought it up to my superiors, I was told to keep quiet. Peter Lawson immediately objected, arguing that Ramirez's testimony was speculative and irrelevant, but the judge overruled him, allowing Brooke to continue. Officer Ramirez, Brooke asked, did you ever witness Officer Porter's use of excessive force? Yes, Ramirez replied, without hesitation. There was an incident during a traffic stop. The driver was black, and Bradley escalated the situation unnecessarily. It ended with the driver being handcuffed and detained for no valid reason. The jury leaned forward, their attention fully captured. Brooke pressed further. And was that incident ever reported? It was, Ramirez said, but nothing came of it. The prosecution's case was growing stronger by the day, and Peter Lawson was struggling to keep up. The defense attempted to counter by calling character witnesses to testify on Bradley's behalf, but their impact was minimal. The jury's minds were already beginning to shift. As the trial dragged on, tensions in the city continued to escalate. Protests turned into clashes, with riot police deployed to control the crowds. Businesses boarded up their windows, and curfews were imposed in certain areas. The city was a powder keg, and everyone knew it was just a matter of time before it exploded. One night, Marcus received an anonymous tip A voicemail left on his phone claimed that a key piece of evidence had been suppressed by the police department, footage from a security camera near the scene of the shooting. The tipster suggested that the footage had been tampered with to protect Bradley. Marcus immediately contacted Brooke, who launched an investigation. Within days, they uncovered a troubling truth. The security footage had indeed been altered. The original footage showed Lewis clearly walking away from the scene, his hands raised, moments before the fatal shot was fired. The tampered version had omitted crucial seconds that contradicted Bradley's account. The chapter ended with Marcus holding the unaltered footage in his hands, his face a mixture of fury and determination. He turned to Brooke, his voice steady but cold. "This is it," he said. "This proves everything. They tried to bury the truth, but now we have it. Lewis will get justice." The courtroom was abuzz the next morning, as Brooke Green prepared to introduce the newly uncovered evidence. The unaltered security footage had the potential to shatter the defense's case entirely. Outside, the streets were alive with anticipation, protesters chanting even louder than before. Inside, every eye was on the prosecution table, waiting for the bombshell to drop. "Your Honor," Brooke began, rising to her feet, "we have obtained new evidence critical to this case. It is an unaltered version of the security footage from the night of the shooting. We believe it will demonstrate clear misconduct by the defendant." Peter Lawson immediately stood, his voice tinged with desperation. "Objection, Your Honor. This evidence was not submitted during discovery, and the defense has not had adequate time to review it." The judge, her expression stern, tapped her gavel lightly. "Miss Green, can you explain why this evidence was not presented earlier?" Brooke nodded. "The original footage was suppressed by the police department. It was only recently uncovered through an anonymous tip, and we believe it is vital to the pursuit of justice." The judge glanced at Lawson, then back at Brooke. "I will allow it. Proceed." The courtroom held its collective breath as the unaltered footage played on the screen. It showed Louis clearly walking away from the private property line, his basketball tucked under his arm, and his hands raised in a gesture of compliance. Mason James appeared moments later, gun drawn, shouting commands. The footage froze just as Louis turned to run, and the unmistakable sound of the gunshot rang out. Gasps and murmurs filled the room. Elsie Wright broke down in tears, her body shaking with sobs. Marcus sat rigid, his jaw clenched, his eyes locked on the screen. Brooke turned to the jury, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "This footage speaks for itself. Lewis Wright was not a threat. He was a scared child trying to go home, and Officer Porter made a choice to pull the trigger when there was no justification." The defense scrambled to recover, but the damage was done. Peter Lawson called Bradley back to the stand, hoping to salvage what little credibility he had left. "Officer Porter," Lawson began, "did you see this footage before it was played in court?" "No," Bradley said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And do you agree that this footage paints a different picture than your initial report?" Bradley hesitated, his throat dry. I don't know. It all happened so fast." Brooke Green pounced during cross-examination. "So fast that you failed to notice a child walking away with his hands up. So fast that you pulled the trigger without verifying whether he posed any threat?" Bradley's shoulders slumped. "I made a mistake," he muttered, barely audible. "A mistake," Brooke repeated. "A mistake that cost a 13-year-old boy his life," Brooke repeated, her voice sharp. Outside the courthouse, the city erupted in both outrage and hope. The unaltered footage was released to the public, and the response was immediate. Protests swelled to unprecedented numbers, and demands for systemic reform grew louder. The police department faced intense scrutiny, with calls for resignations and an independent investigation into the suppression of evidence. Stella Wright joined one of the protests for the first time, standing shoulder to shoulder with strangers who chanted her brother's name. For the first time since Lewis's death, she felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that her family's fight was making a difference. As the trial entered its final days, the prosecution introduced one last piece of evidence, the original call that had brought Bradley to the scene. It was a chilling reminder of the biases that had set the tragic events in motion. The recording played in court, the voice of a panicked neighbor crackling through the speakers. "There's someone suspicious near the basketball court," the caller said. "It's a black boy wearing a hoodie. I think he might be up to something." The neighbor was called to the stand and questioned by Brooke Green. "Did you see Louis Wright commit any crime?" she asked. "No," the neighbor admitted, avoiding eye contact. "Then why did you call the police?" The neighbor fidgeted uncomfortably. I didn't recognize him and he looked out of place." Brooke let the words hang in the air, their implications clear. "Out of place," she repeated. Louis Wright lived in that neighborhood. He had every right to be there. But because of the color of his skin, he was seen as a threat. The chapter ended with Henry Thomas standing outside the courthouse, addressing a sea of protesters and reporters. He held Louis's basketball in his hands, his voice strong despite the weight of his grief. "This is not just about my son," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "This is about every child who has been judged by the color of their skin. This is about every family who has lost someone to senseless violence. We cannot let this continue. We must demand justice, not just for Louis, but for all of us." The crowd erupted into cheers, their chants growing louder. "Justice for Louis!" Marcus raised the basketball high above his head, a symbol of the fight they were all engaged in. The battle was far from over, but in that moment, he knew they were one step closer to the justice his son deserved. The courtroom was quieter than usual as both sides prepared for closing arguments. The weight of the trial, the evidence, and the emotional toll had left everyone exhausted. But this was the moment it would all come to a head. The judge entered, and everyone rose. Henry Thomas watched intently from his seat, his jaw set, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. Elsie sat beside him, holding Stella's hand tightly. Across the room, Mason James looked pale and drawn, the strain of the trial evident in his hollow eyes. Brooke Green rose first, taking her place before the jury. She stood silently for a moment, letting the weight of the case settle over the room before she began. Louis Wright was a boy with dreams, a boy who loved his family, a boy who had every right to grow up. He was not a criminal. He was not a threat. He was a child, scared and running for his life. And yet, his life was cut short because Officer Mason James made a choice to see him as dangerous, a choice to pull the trigger when there was no reason to do so. Brooke walked slowly in front of the jury, her voice steady but charged with emotion. This case is not just about a single tragic mistake. It's about the assumptions that led to that mistake, the bias, the lack of accountability, and the system that allowed a man with a history of complaints to continue carrying a badge and a gun. She turned to the jury, her gaze unwavering. "Louis can't speak for himself, but you can. You can hold Officer Porter accountable. You can send a message that this kind of reckless disregard for human life will not be tolerated." Peter Lawson stood next, adjusting his tie nervously. He knew the evidence was stacked against his client, but his job was to cast doubt, any doubt, that might sway the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone measured, "this case is a tragedy. There's no denying that. A young boy lost his life, and Officer Porter has to live with that for the rest of his days. But tragedy does not equal murder." He paced slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. Officer Porter responded to a call about a potential trespasser. He faced a situation where split-second decisions had to be made. Was it a mistake? Yes. But mistakes, even terrible ones, do not make a man guilty of murder. Lawson stopped, turning to the jury. "I ask you to consider the pressure, the fear, the uncertainty that officers face every day. I ask you to see Officer Porter as a human being, not a symbol. And I ask you to weigh the evidence carefully before making your decision." Outside the courthouse, the city braced for the verdict. Protests had grown larger and more intense, with both sides digging in. Some called for justice, others defended the police, and tensions were reaching a dangerous peak. Henry Thomas addressed the crowd that evening, standing on the courthouse steps with Stella and Elsie by his side. "This trial is not just about my son," he said, his voice strong. "It's about all of us. It's about what kind of society we want to live in. A society where people are judged by their character, not their skin color. A society where justice isn't just a word, but a reality." The crowd roared in agreement, their chants echoing down the streets. But amid the hope, there was also fear. Fear that justice might once again be denied. The next morning, the jury returned to the courtroom to deliver their verdict. The tension in the room was palpable, every breath held as the foreperson stood and handed the paper to the judge. The judge unfolded the paper and read the verdict aloud. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer Mason James, guilty of second-degree murder." The room erupted. Some cried out in relief, others in anger. Bradley slumped in his seat, his face ashen. Marcus gripped Elsie's hand tightly, tears streaming down his face. Justice had been served, but the victory was bittersweet. Louis was still gone, and nothing could bring him back. The chapter ended with Marcus standing outside the courthouse, addressing the crowd one final time. His voice trembled, but carried the weight of his resolve. "This verdict is a step forward, but our fight isn't over. We have to change the system that allowed this to happen. We have to demand accountability, not just for Louis, but for every life lost to injustice. Together, we can make sure this never happens again." The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices carrying the hope of a better future. But as Marcus turned to his family, the grief in his eyes was undeniable. Justice had been won, but the cost had been immeasurable. The days following the verdict were a blur of emotions, from the initial relief of justice to the gnawing emptiness of knowing it wouldn't bring Louis back. The city, too, was torn between a sense of justice served and the realization that the fight for real change was far from over. Mason James's conviction marked a rare victory in a system that had failed too many families like the Wrights. But it was only one piece of a much larger puzzle. Protests continued, louder than ever, as people rallied for broader reform in policing, accountability, and racial justice. Henry Thomas had become a symbol of that fight. Yet, even as the press swarmed around him, he knew the real battle was just beginning. The Wrights had returned to a life forever altered. They had lost Louis, and nothing could fill the void left by his absence. Yet, in the midst of their grief, Marcus found himself leading the charge for change. Each day, his resolve grew stronger. He knew that the moment the verdict was announced, the work wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The Wrights gathered around the dining table one evening, a rare moment of peace in their home. Marcus sat at the head of the table, his face still weary but determined. Elsie, beside him, had a calmness about her, though the grief never truly left her eyes. Stella, her eyes bright despite the heaviness, had become a quiet force of her own, attending rallies, speaking out, and demanding action. "I've been thinking about the next steps," Marcus said, looking at his family. "Louis's death can't be the end of this fight. We have to keep pushing for justice, for real change, or it'll be like his life didn't matter." Elsie nodded slowly. "I agree, Marcus. We can't just rest on this verdict. It's a step forward, but there's so much more to be done. We need to focus on the root of the problem, the system that allowed this to happen in the first place." Stella, who had been quieter than usual, looked up. "What if we help create a movement, something that keeps pushing even after the media moves on to the next story?" Marcus smiled at his daughter. "I think that's exactly what we need. This movement can be for Louis, but it'll be for every other child who's ever been mistreated, for every family who's ever been left without justice." The next few weeks saw Marcus, Elsie, and Stella working tirelessly to organize rallies, write petitions, and speak at conferences about the need for accountability in policing. They met with legislators, advocating for changes to the law that would hold officers accountable for their actions and require more transparency in police departments. Meanwhile, Bradley was beginning his sentence. The weight of his conviction was crushing. In prison, the reality of his actions came to a head. He had tried to justify his decision in the courtroom, but in the silence of his cell, the images of Louis's lifeless body haunted him. The guilt was overwhelming. One day, as Bradley sat in the prison yard, His mind consumed with regret, a fellow inmate approached him. The man was large, tattoos covering most of his arms, his demeanor tough. He sat down across from Bradley, his eyes cold but curious. "You're the cop, right? The one who killed that kid?" the inmate asked bluntly. Bradley nodded, unable to meet the man's gaze. The inmate studied him for a moment, then leaned in closer. "You think you're the only one who's paid the price for that? You killed a kid, man, but you're not the only one suffering because of it." Bradley looked up, surprised by the words. "What do you mean?" The inmate's voice dropped lower. "People like you get to hide behind your badge. You get to go home, get a paycheck, live your life. But when you cross that line, when you kill an innocent person, you don't just pay for it. You drag everyone around you into it. Your family, your friends, they're the ones who have to live with your actions. You may be sitting in here, but you've ruined more lives than just that kid." Bradley fell silent, the weight of the man's words settling heavily on him. For the first time, he understood that this wasn't just about his career or his conviction. It was about the ripple effect of his actions, the pain that spread far beyond that one moment. As the months passed, Marcus's movement gained traction. The Wright family had become the face of the fight for police accountability. Protesters carried signs that read, "No justice, no peace," and "End police brutality." But now there was an added message: justice for Louis. The media kept the story alive, but it was no longer just about the case itself. It had become about something much larger, changing the system that allowed officers like Mason James to operate with little consequence. One evening, Marcus was invited to speak at a conference about police reform. He stood before a crowd of activists, lawmakers, and concerned citizens, his eyes scanning the room. "You've heard the story," Marcus said into the microphone, his voice steady but filled with passion. "Too many families have lost loved ones to violence, to police brutality. Too many officers have gotten away with murder. But we can change that. It starts with accountability. It starts with transparency. It starts with every one of us demanding that the system do better." The crowd erupted into applause, their voices raised in agreement. For the first time in a long time, Marcus felt a glimmer of hope that, just maybe, things could change. But even as the movement grew, the toll it took on the Wright family was undeniable. Marcus felt the pressure of being the public face of the fight for justice. Elsie, too, found herself torn between the constant media demands and the need to protect her family's emotional well-being. Stella, though strong, began to feel the weight of their shared grief. One night, after a particularly grueling press conference, Stella sat alone in her room, staring at the framed photo of Louis. She hadn't realized how much of herself she had poured into this fight, how much of her own identity had become tied to the cause. And yet, despite all the progress, the victory felt hollow. Louis was still gone. The chapter ended with Marcus standing in front of the mirror, staring at his reflection. He saw the tiredness in his own eyes, the lines of stress that had crept into his face. But beneath it all, there was still a fire that would not be extinguished. "For Louis," he whispered to himself, "for every child like him, we'll make them listen. I promise we will." And for the first time in months, he truly believed it. The movement for justice in Louis Wright's name grew into a national reckoning. Cities across the country saw protests, town hall meetings, and legislative hearings focused on police reform. Henry Thomas had become a household name, his voice a rallying cry for accountability and change. Yet, even as the movement gained momentum, resistance to it grew just as fierce. Police unions pushed back hard. Officers from Mason James's precinct held press conferences defending him, claiming the trial had been unfairly influenced by public pressure. A few pundits painted Marcus and his family as opportunists profiting from tragedy. For every step forward, it seemed another force tried to push them back. Late one night, Marcus sat in his study, poring over drafts of a proposed bill aimed at improving police accountability. It included measures such as mandatory body cameras, independent investigations into police shootings, and the creation of a civilian oversight board. It was a comprehensive plan, but getting lawmakers to adopt it was another battle entirely. Elsie entered the room, carrying a steaming cup of tea. She placed it gently on the desk beside him and sat down across from him. "You've been at this for hours," she said softly. "You need to rest." "I can't," Marcus replied, rubbing his temples. "Every time I close my eyes, I see Louis. I hear his voice. And then I remember he's gone. I can't stop, Elsie. If I do, it feels like I'm letting him down." Elsie reached across the desk, taking his hand in hers. "You're not letting him down. You're honoring him. But you can't do this alone. Let people help you." Marcus sighed, his gaze falling to the basketball on the shelf. It was Louis's favorite, the one he'd been carrying the night he was killed. "I know," he said quietly. "But it's hard. It feels like if I stop, even for a second, everything we've built will fall apart." Meanwhile, Stella had taken a bold step of her own. She had started speaking at rallies, sharing stories about Louis, his humor, his kindness, his dreams. Her words resonated deeply, especially with young people who saw themselves in her brother. At one rally, Stella stood before a crowd of thousands. Her voice shook at first, but she found strength in their cheers. "My brother was 13, she began. "He loved basketball and wanted to be an engineer. He wasn't a threat. He wasn't dangerous. He was just a kid. And he deserved to grow up." She paused, her eyes scanning the crowd. "We can't bring him back, but we can make sure his death wasn't in vain. We can make sure no other family has to feel this pain. That's what my parents are fighting for. That's what I'm fighting for. And we won't stop until we win." The crowd erupted into applause, chanting, "Justice for Louis," over and over. Stella stepped off the stage, her heart pounding but filled with a sense of purpose. She was no longer just Louis's sister. She was a voice for change, but not everyone was ready for that change. Late one night, as the Wright family returned home from a town hall meeting, they found their front yard vandalized. Spray painted across their driveway in bright red letters were the words, "Go back where you came from." Elsie gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Stella stared in disbelief, her fists clenched at her sides. Marcus, however, remained silent, his jaw tight as he took in the hateful message. "We'll call the police," Elsie said, her voice trembling. Marcus shook his head. "They won't do anything. We'll handle it ourselves." "Handle it how?" Stella demanded, her voice rising. "Dad, they're threatening us. What if they come back? What if they—" "They won't," Marcus said firmly. "Because we won't let them scare us. We're not backing down." The family spent the rest of the night scrubbing the driveway clean. Neighbors came out to help, their silent support speaking volumes. It was a small act of defiance, but it fueled Marcus's resolve even further. In prison, Mason James was struggling to adjust. His conviction had made him a target among inmates, many of whom had been victims of police brutality themselves. He spent most of his time alone, grappling with the weight of his actions. One day, he received a letter. The handwriting was neat and deliberate, the words carefully chosen. It was from Henry Thomas. Bradley hesitated before opening it, unsure of what to expect. The letter was short, but its message was clear. "You will spend the rest of your life reckoning with what you did to my son. But even in my anger, I hope you learn. I hope you change. Because if you don't, then Louis's death will truly have been in vain. Henry Thomas." Bradley stared at the letter for a long time, the words sinking in. For the first time, he began to think about what it would mean to change, not just for himself, but for the system he had been a part of. As the weeks passed, the proposed police accountability bill gained traction. Lawmakers began to take notice, thanks to relentless pressure from activists and the Wright family's growing influence. Marcus testified before Congress, delivering an impassioned plea for change. "This isn't about politics," he said. "It's about lives. It's about ensuring that no other child ends up like my son. It's about justice." The chapter ended with Marcus standing on the steps of the state capitol, surrounded by supporters holding signs that read, "Pass the bill now." The crowd was electric, their chants echoing across the city. Marcus raised his hand, quieting the crowd. "This is our moment," he said, his voice steady. "For Louis, for every life lost, for justice. The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices carrying a sense of hope and determination. But as Marcus looked out at the sea of faces, he knew the fight was far from over. The real battle had just begun. The work had just begun. The day the police accountability bill was set to be voted on, the atmosphere in the state capitol was electric. Crowds gathered outside the building, chanting and holding signs, while lawmakers filed into the chamber under the watchful eyes of media cameras. The bill had become a flashpoint, sparking fierce debate and drawing national attention. Inside the chamber, Henry Thomas sat in the gallery with Elsie and Stella by his side. He held Louis's basketball in his lap, gripping it tightly. It had become his symbol, a reminder of the fight they were waging, not just for Louis, but for all the lives lost to a system that had failed them. The floor was tense as the debate unfolded. Supporters of the bill argued passionately for accountability, for transparency, for change. Opponents raised concerns about how the legislation might hinder law enforcement, repeating familiar arguments about making their jobs harder. As the debate raged on, Marcus felt a pit in his stomach. He knew they had done everything they could, but he also knew how fragile hope could be. Meanwhile, outside the Capitol, the crowd swelled to unprecedented numbers. Activists, community leaders, and ordinary citizens stood together, their voices echoing through the streets. Stella had joined them, holding a sign that read, "Justice for Louis." Her presence energized the crowd, and her words carried weight when she addressed them. "We've come too far to stop now," she shouted into the microphone. "This bill isn't just about fixing a broken system, it's about saving lives. It's about making sure no family has to go through what we went through. We are here today for Louis, but we're also here for every name, every story, every life that deserves justice." The crowd roared in agreement, their chants growing louder and more unified. The energy outside was palpable, a wave of determination surging toward the lawmakers inside. As the debate inside the chamber reached its climax, the final speeches were made. A young representative, a mother herself, stood and addressed the room. "I have 2 children at home," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Every day I wonder if they'll come home safe. But I shouldn't have to wonder. No parent should. This bill isn't about punishing police officers. It's about protecting our communities, building trust, and ensuring accountability. It's about saying that every life matters." Her words were met with applause from the gallery, where Marcus nodded silently, his heart pounding. The chamber quieted as the speaker called for the vote. The roll call began, each name and vote reported. Marcus gripped Elsie's hand tightly, his breath shallow as he waited for the final tally. When the result was announced, a wave of emotion swept through the room. "The bill passes." For a moment, there was silence as the words sank in. Then the gallery erupted into cheers and applause. Elsie wept openly, her face buried in her hands, while Stella embraced her father, tears streaming down her cheeks. Marcus sat in stunned silence, clutching Louis's basketball as a flood of emotions washed over him. Outside, the crowd exploded with joy. People hugged, cried, and chanted, "Justice for Louis." The atmosphere was one of triumph, a hard-fought victory finally realized. In the days that followed, the impact of the bill's passage began to ripple outward. Police departments across the state were required to implement the new reforms, and the focus on accountability and transparency brought a renewed sense of hope to many communities. The fight wasn't over. There was still much work to be done, but the passage of the bill was a monumental step forward. For the Wright family, the victory was bittersweet. They had achieved what they set out to do, but the void left by Louis's absence remained. They celebrated the milestone, knowing that their fight had honored his memory and paved the way for others. One evening, Marcus sat in his study, staring at Louis's basketball. Stella walked in and sat beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. "We did it, Dad," she said softly. "Louis would be so proud." Marcus smiled faintly, his eyes glistening. "We did it for him," he said, "and for everyone like him." Stella nodded, her voice steady. "But it's not over. We have to keep going." Marcus turned to her, his expression filled with pride. "And we will," he said, "because that's what Louis would have wanted." The story ended with Marcus, Elsie, and Stella standing together at the edge of a basketball court where a mural of Louis had been painted. It showed him smiling, holding a basketball, with the words, "Justice for Louis," emblazoned above. As the sun set behind them, casting the mural in a warm golden glow, the family stood hand in hand, united in their grief and their hope. They had turned their pain into purpose, their tragedy into a movement. And while the road ahead was long, they knew they would walk it together, carrying Louis's memory with them every step of the way.